Hi, my name is Adam Sitze. I teach in the Department of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought at Amherst College, and today I'll be talking with Lindsay Stern, whose book, The Study of Animal Languages, will be released tomorrow, February 19th, 2019. Welcome, Lindsay, and congratulations on a phenomenal book.
Thank you.
Why don't we start by just having you talk a little bit about the book and the process of writing it and how that happened.
It's hard to say exactly where a creative project starts, but there was an afternoon when I walked into the office of Professor Alexander George, who teaches analytic philosophy here, and he is notorious for keeping a gimmick lie detector on his file cabinet. This device would flash either green or red in response to surrounding noise, and on the afternoon that I walked into his office, it was flashing red, and it was a spring afternoon in April. No one was talking, but the window was open, and it was picking up the melody of a bird and declaring that the bird was lying. So that image kind of lodged as like a koan in my mind almost, both because of the mystery it raised about what these sounds that we tend to tune out as gibberish might actually mean, and as I started reading about the scientific attempt to know them and decode them, the absurdity of thinking that we could ever translate them into English. And out of that question that began as a kind of intellectual goad, characters formed, and I found that fiction presented the kind of most fluid, dynamic, risky in some ways medium to explore the question.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the characters. So you have a family, I think it's safe to say. You have, the novel is narrated by an analytic philosopher named Ivan Link, who's 47 years old. It takes place, would it be fair to say, over several days, I guess in the late winter, early spring.
Right.
Ivan is married to I guess she's an ornithologist named Prue Baum, and her father's name is Franklin Baum. Talk a little bit about how these characters came to you, and maybe about why they came to you as vessels for the exploration of the problem of birdsong and truth and falsity.
This often happens, I'm told, but the very first scene of the book was a marriage scene between Prue and Ivan involving a catastrophic toast delivered by her brother. And it was a booster rocket, so the book totally outgrew it, and in the final version they elope. So it was both omitted literally and as a plot point. I was incredibly fortunate to get this crazy fellowship called the Watson, where you have to leave the United States for a year and pursue a project of your own design. And mine was to teach a combination of philosophy and creative writing at a few English-speaking orphanages, and to spend the other half of the year writing the first draft of a novel that became this one. But my first leg, I had basically, in a semi-cliched way I see now, declared that I was going to go to Paris and live for free in this bookstore and write the first draft over a month's time. And so it was the hubris of youth. It's just a word of mouth thing, but if you're interested in writing, you can go there. It's an open secret, and you just show up with some bags and you take the risk that they won't have you, but if they have spots, you can sleep for free in it. It's also haunted. Needless to say, the novel did not come, and instead I made pages and pages and pages of notes that were vital, but they were many of them were they were kind of raw ideas, and they didn't find a home in an essay form or a monograph form, and I knew that they were kind of fomenting the novel I wanted to write, but not really participating in that novel because they had no characters to belong to or to matter to. And then I went to Cambodia, and I was living in this guest house called Tattoo, And I was incredibly fortunate to meet one of my best friends there and to be able to connect with some of the most amazing people through my teaching that I've ever met, who challenged me to think in ways that I hadn't really encountered as part of my formal education. And something about that environment, combined with the relief of having left Paris, I think enabled me to relax in such a way that the characters started finding their way on the page, and they started finding their way on the page through scenes. And that's when I realized that it was probably going to look more like a dramatic project as opposed to a stream of consciousness or a full dramatic monologue.
Which character came to you first? Or perhaps you're saying, in the scene that you wrote about the catastrophic toast, was it a number of characters that came to you at the same time?
It was always in Ivan's voice, partly because I was so intrigued by just the first person point of view and how the voice of the ego occludes and reveals what's the forces that are producing it. And when you have a character speaking, it's presupposed that there's an addressee. And there's a paradox in first-person books, too, that who is this person addressing, especially if they don't acknowledge the addressee. But there's a constructedness about it, so that the kind of falsity of that intrigued me and felt like a more fertile medium to explore the mind than, for whatever reason, given that this project I knew was going to deal with the codes of the mind and the sense of language being like that. It felt like an appropriate thing to do. So I guess, given that, Ivan came first, and then Prue speaking to him at that deleted scene, and her brother, and Frank's father-in-law arrives. His voice now opens the book, but he didn't show up until I think the third chapter of the first draft, and it was almost like this just person came onto the page, and I knew that he was bringing energy. And that's what told me that he belonged in the beginning, because he kind of woke Ivan up to me as a character. Before, he and Prue had been very static, and their conversations had been even more stilted than they are, and stilted in a way that wasn't masking the kind of dilemmas that they're dealing with in their marriage. It just, the writing wasn't alive yet, and it was Frank who brought that.
So this is a novel that ends with, the last word of the novel is begin. And so maybe it makes sense to begin with the last character that you formulated, Franklin. Franklin is, he's a vegetarian. He's a really compelling character. It would make sense to me why he would bring to the novel a kind of interruptive energy, almost a prophetic energy. At one point, his daughter Prue says, "You think you're prophetic, but in fact you're just a provocateur." I think it's safe to say either he has a mental illness or he's diagnosed with a mental illness. And throughout the novel, there's a kind of subplot about him taking his pills or not, or being dosed, perhaps even against his will, when he's hospitalized after particularly manic episodes. So talk a little bit about what Franklin personifies, and maybe say something about how you're exploring the limits of DSM-4, or the limits of psychology, or the limits of psychiatry through the character of Frank or Franklin.
So the DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders, I remember encountering the most recent edition back when I was doing the first draft, and I was so struck by the fact that according to this other study, most people will qualify for some disorder in the manual that's codified in the manual over the course of their life. And that figure fluctuates a little bit. Sometimes it's a little bit under 50%, but details aside, that the irony of that to be normal, you're insane, and vice versa, felt to me like a little bit of a reductio ad absurdum of our current thinking about the mind. I guess, I remember also, as part of writing this, I read a lot of the scientific literature on birdsong, and there was one particular study that came out in 2011, and it was widely reported in the popular press with headlines like, "Scientists discover that birds tweet using grammar," and that they have, that there's some evidence that they might have syntax, which Chomsky famously defined as the hallmark of human language and thought, although the relationship between the two has been hotly contested. I guess I thought, I was just reading these studies and I just thought, on the one level we're saying this, but on the other hand, it would seem one would have to be psychotic to hear birdsong and really feel the presence of a language. So I guess it was kind of in that margin that Frank started to come into being. I guess, he's somebody who is hyper attuned to the world and to the majesty of everyday objects, and that part of him announces itself in his manic episodes. I guess through him I was trying to think through why it is that that point of view, that kind of heightened attunement to things, is unsustainable and potentially damaging. Of course, it's in his, everyone would experience it differently, but those were some of the my own preoccupations that fed him.
It does seem that Frank is pitched perfectly between hearing things and having manic episodes. So at one point, he's in the aquarium with his granddaughter and his son-in-law, and he confronts the attendant about why the sharks and the various aquatic animals are being held captive, for how long they're being held captive, and so forth. And he takes a metallic umbrella and smashes the window to the tank, trying to, it's not clear from the narration what he's trying to do, perhaps liberate the animals, perhaps destroy the world in which incarcerated animals would be objects of entertainment. It's not clear. In that episode, he claims not to be hearing things, but to be hearing things. He's really carefully, he's so attuned that he says that they speak to me in the same way that music speaks to me. I'm directly affected by it. And in the same way that at the outset of the novel, he's saying, well, sometimes when you walk into Grand Central Station, you just, everything signifies. Everything is a matter, everything is talking to me at the same time. But then I guess my question would be how he then relates to Ivan, the analytic philosopher, who narrates the novel in large, or it's told from his first-person perspective. He seems to have trouble hearing things, and in particular, part of the interest and part of the skill, I think, and the power of the narrative is how Ivan actually can't hear the many messages that are coming at him. So if Frank hears too much, maybe Ivan can't hear enough. Tell me a little bit about the relationship between Franklin and Ivan. They do come to share something at the end. They have in common that all their life they've been waiting for something. The novel opens with this beautiful phrase, "All my life I've been waiting for something." And I found out that what I've been waiting for is just more waiting. Frank opens the novel in those terms. But tell me a little bit about how you imagine this relationship between Frank and Ivan, and about how listening in particular, or hearing, figures into that relationship.
Part of what I was trying to explore was what's at work in this word animal, that, at least in the law, means a thing. Animals other than humans are property in the US. I think there's a little bit of madness in that. And we know from the history of law that that same violence has been inflicted on the members of the human community. So I guess, I mean, what Frank does is crazy, and it's also wounding, potentially, to the person he cares most for. But at the same time, it was important to me that he articulate some of the lunacy in that structure, where one walks through a museum that participates in the illusion that law participates in, that the beings with whom we share so much evolutionary history and with whom we can even make contact controversially would be relegated to non-persons or non-sentient entities. See, language starts breaking down when you think about animals, and that's why I found them so fascinating. There's a quick anecdote that I encountered in a book by Elaine Corbin, who's a historian of bells, for a course that I'm in. And it's just a wonderful anecdote, and I think it will help me answer your question about Frank and Ivan. In the mid-1800s, in this southern French village called Le Bruze, there was a civil war that erupted over whether to ring the bell tower in thunderstorms. Half the town argued that you should ring the bell because it would ward the thunder off, and the other half of the town argued that it would have the opposite consequence and would actually entice the storms. And so they came to blows. Some people were wounded and died, and finally the mayor issued a decree saying, we're not going to ring the bells, it's too much of a risk. A few weeks later, a thunderstorm came, and half the town fled to the bell tower and started clanging it with all their might, which is, of course, the last place you want to be in a thunderstorm, as we now know. But of course, I think what's so resonant about the story is the fact that both factions agreed on the relevant claim, which is that the bell tower could choreograph the actions of the sky. And so I think in their ways, Frank and Ivan, this was initially called The Philosopher and the Madman, and to me, their dialectic and their kind of strife and their eventual harmony governed the movement of the book. And I was interested in the ways that, on the one hand, they can't stand each other, and they orient themselves toward the world in incommensurable ways, but they both have this kind of, in my mind, tragic ambition for language and what it can do, and how it can make things clear if only one could say it. But their attempts to do so kind of drive them out of the human community. And so in that sense, I think they're a little bit analogous to the Bell story, in the sense that they share more than they realize.
And so if Frank errs on the side of hearing beings immediately and with his body, and errs on the side of, or takes to excess, this idea that you can hear or communicate immediately with beings with whom we share the earth, and if that it estranges him certainly from his daughter Prue, who confronts him later in the novel, but also from indeed the entire law-abiding community, because he's detained after this attack. Let's talk a little bit maybe about Ivan and about the way in which Ivan errs. I'm struck, first of all, that Ivan lost his father at an early age. And so Ivan is somebody who, over the course of the novel, again, he's the person whose ego structures the narration. And so what we know largely is from his standpoint. That loss seems, first of all, to determine, or at least to kind of prepare the conditions under which he then has what might be called a crisis later in the novel, where mounting rage and resentment and perhaps a sense of loss just overcome him in ways that he doesn't understand. And I'm curious, first of all, about how his loss of his father at an early age plays into his relationship with his father-in-law. But I also would like to return to this point about analytic philosophy. He's an analytic philosopher. He's written a PhD thesis on a particular problem, which I'm hoping you'll describe, a philosophic problem. And he is really clear about the fact that animals do not talk. He has a fight with Prue later in the novel in which he says that frankly and forthrightly. In fact, he uses the phrase, the study of animal languages, he puts it in quotes early in the novel. So he seems to disagree with the title of the novel. He seems to think that animals don't have language. But talk a little bit about, if Frank errs on the side of communicating directly with beings, let's talk a little bit about Ivan and about his about his commitment to language, his commitment to maybe even meaning, and about how that allowed you, or how that gave you the occasion to create a kind of maybe unreliable narrator.
Yes, Ivan objects to the phrase animal language, which many scientists and especially linguists would also object to, and that actually gave me pause about the title, because super egoically I was anticipating them, their dismissiveness. The reason that they object to it is, I think, much more interesting than their objection, and it has to do with this distinction between communication and language, which to me is fascinating in that, so traditionally communication refers to the exchange of information, and language to that activity that we participate in that no other beings can. And the dictionary definition is a tautology, because it includes us in the definition. It's what humans do to communicate. So there's a kind of paradox bound up with even asking whether other beings have language. I think that's exactly why these two people felt fused to me in some way. Frank and Ivan, the analytic philosopher, and the madman who potentially becomes the philosopher, and vice versa, depending on how one responds to it. But I mean, Ivan's someone who is trying to talk to beings, and he can't. He can't even really talk to his own wife. I mean, that's part of what I was interested in exploring, the impulse to take the intimacy of consciousness as a problem to solve using syllogisms or mathematics, which is how analytic philosophers sometimes treat the problem of solipsism. No matter what evidence you may have that other beings think and feel, their sensations and their thoughts will never belong to you in the way that yours belong to you. But for Ivan, it's really painful, partly probably because of his history, and that's partly why I think Frank can speak to him in a way that others can't, that what Frank says riles him, so much so that he unconsciously helps catalyze Frank's breakdowns in ways he doesn't understand, but that his wife points out. So yeah, he's someone who I think, I mean, in order to kind of deal with the world and deal with the chaos of life, resorts to strategies that end up exacerbating that chaos. And one strategy that he has just intellectually is the use of a monograph that he publishes to solve the Gettier problem, which you mentioned, but that is the idea that it's a challenge to the view that knowledge is justified true belief, and it derives from a brilliant paper published in the 1960s by a philosopher named Edmund Gettier, and in it he presents a few very brief thought experiments that show that that theory breaks down in certain circumstances, so you can have a true belief and cite evidence for it, and therefore you'd seem to have a justified true belief, but he gives us cases in which there's no connection between your evidence and the truth, and it just happens to be the case that you had thought that they were connected. And so to Ivan, this is an incredibly troubling problem, because it's important to him that he know why he knows something if he knows it, which I think is a peculiar way of seeing the world, but one that I've found compelling, hence my majoring in analytic philosophy. So, but anyway, so that was one of the most fun parts, just as a fiction writer, to kind of show how his life ends up enacting that problem, and he, but to not try to do so in a schematic way, but he of course has evidence that his marriage is failing. It is, but his evidence bears no relationship to that fact, even though he's just published what he thinks is a solution to the problem.
And I just want to read that chapter, or this from chapter 17, where he describes his solution to the Gettier problem, because it involves something else that I'd wanted to ask you about, or simply to remark upon. My solution to the Gettier problem rests on a thought experiment. To the question, how can we really know anything if we cannot rule out the possibility that our knowledge might be true simply by chance, I pose the following case. An archer draws his bow in a thunderstorm, aiming it at a passing hawk. Though his technique is poor, the wind carries his arrow to the bird, which falls dead. One of the things I admired about the novel, especially on second read, is just how subtly you show us that our speech, our idioms, when I'm flapping my hands when I'm talking, or when I call somebody a bird brain, or when I see that students flock to a professor, or that someone has batty ideas. I think you do a really splendid idea just demonstrating how fully birds inhabit just our ordinary speech, in just the same way it seems to me that Frank at one point, in a party, he stands up on a table and starts ranting about how the products of cows are everywhere in our life, and they're a kind of absent presence. And I thought, even Ivan's not aware of it, but there are birds, and the killing of a bird is internal to his solution to this philosophic problem, in a way that seems antithetical to the way that his wife thinks about birds, which I know we need to get to. So I just wanted to remark upon that. But this might be a good time to talk a little bit about their marriage, because the Gettier problem, and particularly the inflection of it that involves inaccurate beliefs that actually lead to right conclusions, seems to structure a pivotal moment in the novel, where Ivan rushes to a bookstore, and maybe you can tell us what happens next. I mean, many people will have read the novel, but is this a spoiler alert? Are we supposed to be doing this?
I actually had Amherst books in mind.
Okay.
Because you just use scaffolding of places, and mine doesn't have to. But no, but yes, he misreads the voice of a friend of his wife who had called her and thinks that they're having an affair, and bolts into the bookstore where he's giving a reading and confronts him. And at this point, people who have encountered him will know that he's a pain, and his voice is so saddled with his attempts to tamp himself down. And even the writing of the first third of the book was a strain at times because of that. And at this point, it started to write itself a little bit earlier than this, but once he starts breaking down, I just had to observe, really. It didn't feel like writing, because he felt like he was finally, his libido was freed, so to speak, even though he's destroying his life. And so the language itself, his point of view in that sense, it's free, and he is himself finally, but it's too late, because it's happening at the wrong time, and it's as a result of a misunderstanding. I mean, it felt to me like he was having a slow motion kind of catharsis. Colm Toybeen once defined a novel as the change, and I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, and he spoke it out loud at a reading, but the change in a character's personality prompted by a loss it does not understand. I think something gets unlocked, tragic comically, because it ruins the material aspects of his life. But to me, it's wonderful what happens to him. He finally starts to live.
He cries for the first time.
Right.
He had talked about his inability to cry earlier. He hasn't cried in years, he says, and then finally, after this cathartic moment, he's able to cry, and in a way, he reaches the madman and the philosopher reach agreement on a definition of philosophy, and up till that point, they hadn't agreed at all. In fact, Frank seems scornful almost of, at times, of what it is that Ivan does. But I just want to read from the last pages here, where Ivan and Frank are together in Frank's apartment in Vermont. It's funny, I say, this is Ivan talking, I've been alive for almost half a century and I don't know the first thing about anything. Amen. Frank slaps his knee, rousing Cordelia, who is his cat. I used to think life would go like this. You get bashed around a bit, fuck up, lose people, and in the process figure out what really matters. But now, he sips from my water glass. It's Ivan still talking. It's more like figuring out that your life was never even about you to begin with. You're not the hero. You're just someone in the cast. I'll be damned, Frank says. You're starting to sound like a philosopher. So it's almost as though that catharsis, and then as I said, the last word of the novel is begin. And so that catharsis in some way brings him into maybe alignment, better attunement perhaps with Frank. He himself becomes frank in the adjectival sense. He begins speaking frankly or kind of candidly to people in alarming, disturbing ways to his colleagues. But it's almost as if the ability to speak the truth in this novel, both in Frank and in Ivan, are incommensurable with the procedures that a college has or for regulating true statements, tenure among them or true-false machines, inside or outside offices as well. This is a novel about a marriage, certainly, and I want to get back to that, but it's also a novel about speaking the truth and nobody being able to hear it. He finally becomes a philosopher, or his father-in-law says, you're finally beginning to sound like a philosopher, at the very moment when he's lost his job as a philosopher. Prue also speaks the truth in a way that seems to ruin her tenure case. So what is this novel saying in each of these three characters? There seems to be an impulse in each of them to speak the truth and an inability on the part of, let's say, the academy to hear them.
I think you're picking up on something I was trying to explore, absolutely, which is what the institutionalization of an attempt to speak the truth or discover the truth that one could say the academy is, participates in the muzzling of that. But to me, I mean, you could accuse any institution of any variety of things, but to me what has such pathos in the sense of the institution of the university is that it wants to move beyond those limits. And I mean, in a class that helped sow the seeds of this book, which you taught, Plato and the Poets, we read the whole sweep of Plato's works from the Aporetic Dialogues to the later works culminating in the Laws. And one argument that you introduced us to was the view that Plato, even in his love of his mentor Socrates, Plato, who introduced Socrates' truth to us today, put to death, figuratively, Socrates in the later works, in his pivot away from the form of speech and the gentle undoing that Socrates encouraged in anyone he encountered on the street into the kind of system building that no longer had a place for Socrates, all in the name of love, and all in the name of his protagonist. And I just thought that was a beautiful and heartbreaking tragedy in itself, that transcends any particular work, but that structures its sequence. I never thought of this, or of kind of wanting to write a campus novel or a kind of comedy about academia, I guess because it came from a place, a maybe ingenuous place of love for the academy and love for an institution that unabashedly tries to learn for the sake of learning and discover for the sake of discovering, as opposed to becoming a knowledge factory. I mean, as Socrates teaches us, to love something doesn't mean to kowtow to it and praise it constantly. And yeah, I think that those were the kind of institutions and how they try and fail to honor the attempt to seek truth was absolutely on my mind.
Let's talk about Prue, because Prue is involved, it seems to me, in that exact dilemma. Prue is the daughter of Frank, and has been invited to give a prestigious speech at the college where both Ivan and Prue teach. She studied critical theory, which Ivan hates, and she works on she works on the study of animal languages. She herself is her mother is the child of Holocaust survivors, so there's a kind of sense there's a sense in which loss determines her life as well. But I want to talk about her speech. So the novel is structured it has 3 parts. And in the first part, Ivan goes to pick up Frank, and they are preparing for the speech. And part 1 ends with the speech itself. And then part 2 deals with the immediate aftermath of that speech, a party in particular. And then part 3 is what we've already talked about. It's Ivan's cathartic kind of, in a way, his release and his new beginning, but in a way, the destruction of his material life as a philosopher. But let's talk about Prue. Prue gives a speech where she makes some really profound claims. And in some way, it's related to the way that her father, a vegetarian, thinks about animals. But in a way, it's dealing with her love of her own discipline. I want to read some of the passages that are really just barbed here, and talk about them as a kind of example of, let's say, Socratic critique. She talks about 2 experiments. The first experiment, and I'm quoting here from a speech she gives, and viewers need to imagine a very august ceremony. The president's there, the dean is there, all the students are there members of the public. It's a really wonderful occasion. And so all eyes are on her. She's wearing a set of pearls that occupy Ivan's attention because he doesn't recognize them, and he thinks they've been given to her by somebody else. And this is what she says. The first experiment represents that second dimension of science, basic research conducted for the sole purpose of furthering knowledge about the animal in question. It demonstrates that voles, like humans, have voices, that the apparent silence between them is actually seething with sounds, because the experiment basically shows that voles that are companions in some way behave differently in stress situations than voles who are solitary. And so the experiment she's describing indicates that animals, essentially, voles in particular, have modes of communication that escape our ability to understand them. I mean, the first thing I have to say is that silence seething with sound sounds like a description of the field that this novel is able to observe. It seems like one of the conclusions that I came away with as a reader is that part of the vocation of the novel is to actually perceive this field of silence seething with sound in a way that its protagonists can't, not from a God's eye perspective, but from a perspective that's neither philosophy nor biolinguistics nor the kind of prophetic kind of almost arrogance of somebody who immediately understands animals. And so to me, the study of animal languages equally pertains to the languages that take place between, Prue and Ivan. But in any case, taken together, the experiments teach us a third, less obvious and more important lesson. That lesson will be my subject today. It's not about voles, Prue says, but about the life sciences, and it may have already occurred to you. How, you might be wondering, can the same field of inquiry interpret the same animal, the vole, as both a being with a voice and simultaneously a proxy for human flesh? And I left out that essentially the voles had been experimented on in other ways. Why, moreover, does its status, the vole's status as a human proxy, not prevent us from torturing it? The answer, she says, is that the life sciences are pathological. Year after year, in paper after paper, we biologists interpret other animals as two contradictory phenomena, subjects of their own worlds and objects to mutilate. This is a really profound criticism of the way that the life sciences treat animals. And to me, it's mirrored by the inability of the analytic philosopher in the story, Ivan, to think clearly about animal languages, or rather his idea of clarity prevents him from acknowledging that there's something like an animal language. Tell me a little bit about what she's after in this speech. She, in a response to a question, she claims that this is out of love, that she's making this critique of the life sciences out of love. Is she a reliable narrator in that instance, or help us understand why she makes this speech in the first place?
When she makes it, my understanding was that there's nothing in it that she would want to disavow. And I think that remains pretty much true over the few days that the novel takes place. But it's, as I hope will shine through in certain ways, it was important to me to have one chapter that was just pure, unadulterated speech, and it's not in quotation marks either. But then to kind of explore how it is not heard or heard selectively and ramifies through people in different ways and gets taken up for different purposes, and that the whole thing is, in a way, her own speech act of saying I'm claustrophobic in my marriage and in my career. But that's not something that is clear to her when she says it. I think that it's coming from a genuine place in that anyone who takes a look at the literature on animals and animal models, I think will detect a puzzling fact, which is that they in science, they call it basic research versus applied research. So basic research conducted just for the sake of learning about other worlds, animal minds, etc., animal communication systems, and applied research conducted, funded by the pharmaceutical industry, conducted to develop drugs in the animal that then impact how we think and how we navigate the world. I think what she's reacting to in a hyperbolic way is this dissonance and, you could say, unbridgeable abyss between treating the animal as a human proxy for developing the drugs that'll keep us sane, and treating it as this kind of alien to just explore. And I think she's kind of responding to that feeling of feeling like there's something crazy that we're doing, and that we keep doing, partly out of inertia and partly because it's just how we've done things in the past. It was important to me that she be saying something for which one could make some kind of argument that there be something legible in what she was saying, but that it also be so freighted, as it clearly is, with the kind of crisis she's going through, and that, like Ivan, she doesn't really understand the kind of difficulties that she deals with, which explain why she's spending her life with this person with whom she's clearly terribly matched. Back to your point about Frank and Ivan, these are two people who are both passionately interested in language, and yet, unlike in the Bell example, there's nothing uniting. They seem to have an affinity, but they could not be more estranged. And they seem to be both looking for a bird's eye view of things. Him in his sense of a totalizing picture, her in her sense of a bird's actual point of view. But that circle can't be squared in their case.
It's quite striking. The three characters that we've all talked about each miss the mark. They each misrecognize the speech of animals. They're passionately invested in each case in the question. But in some way, the novel stages a series of missed encounters with that. So she's struggling with a contradiction internal to the life sciences. Ivan just totally forecloses on the question and really needs to in order for his own philosophic study of language to remain coherent. And Frank proposes to have immediate communication with animals. So what is the novel teaching us about what it means to be with animals? You know, we're faced with the mass extinction of animals. This is going on during our lifetime. And we are in a moment where there's massive factory farming of birds and on an ongoing basis. So the novel is definitely saying something or engaging in this question.
Yeah, it's a question that haunts me. And I mean, we're all, I think if you want to think about complicity, animals present a really fertile point of departure for that. I mean, we're sitting on chairs that are made from their bodies. So there's no opportunity really to live in such a way that you're not making use of instrumentalizing them, participating in suffering in some way. So, and that's, I think, what Frank reacts to. But I think, I mean, what I think is almost most interesting about the animal question is this fiction that it often invokes, that these are these other interesting beings, like almost like aliens, and oh, we should keep them around so that maybe we can learn more from them or enjoy touring their preserves, which is an almost, I mean, colonial kind of spirit. And whereas I think the real question is the human animal and how we've gotten to this vertiginous place of having conquered the earth and realizing that we're going to be the only act in town. There's a great Richard Wilbur poem about this called Advice to a Prophet, where he asks in his gentle yet subtly subversive way where we will find ourselves once all of the ways that we've understood ourselves, the bird brains, the battiness, the flocking. Animals infuse not only our world physically, but also our language. And I think that bodes poorly for how we will relate to each other and ourselves once they're gone. So what I find compelling about thinking with animals is the kind of absurdity and comedy and horror that it brings home about how we're relating to ourselves and what we've been doing here. So far from kind of recruiting interesting tidbits in the way that popular science journalism does. I mean, in useful ways, but in ways that if one's sense of the animal is limited to that, participates in the illusion that they are not about us and what we're doing at that. So I think that's why this wound up as a story about humans.
Let's talk about forgiveness a little bit, because it seems to me that one way that Prue is able to think about the relationship to animals and what it means to be with animals right now is proposed to her by a novelist whose name is Dalton Field. Is that right? Who seems to have interesting ideas about what it means to be in a marriage, or at least in a love relationship, and also what it means to think about the problems that she's thinking about in her lecture. I'm going to read a passage where he intervenes in the question and answer after her lecture. We've already had one person's storm out by this point. Jeremiah Wood, an ornithologist who championed Prue's application, leaves, and he'll later write an email saying, I can't basically support your tenure anymore after this. You have John Sawyer, a professor of linguistics, who poses an extremely sharp question that she doesn't entirely respond to, but it's in response to his question that she says, I love my field, which had prompted my question about Socrates earlier. But he raises a question, and Ivan by this point is already a little bit on the verge of a kind of Iago-like jealousy towards Dalton. He's beginning to nurse a sense of kind of sense that there's something going on between Dalton and Prue. And I'm just going to read Dalton's question. Dalton, by the way, is, for viewers who haven't read the book, Dalton is author of a novel called Forgive Me Not, so that will be relevant. A shuffling as the microphone is passed. I think it's magnificent, the questioner booms, your implication that we're not the wiser animals, but the demented ones. That insanity, not wisdom, explains our dominance, end quote. Dalton, this is Ivan talking. Dalton, his legs are crossed, one arm draped across the back of the neighboring seat, probably occupied by someone he doesn't even know. Not Homo sapiens, but Homo infirmum, he adds. Why else would we have vandalized the earth? Give me a fucking break, I think. As I close my eyes, Quinn whispers. Quinn is a colleague. Quinn whispers, he's great. This is Dalton again. You've raised the question of what other animals might say to us if we would listen, he continues. What, I wonder, would you say to them? Ah, Prue smiles mischievously. Good question. I don't know. Forgive me? The reference to his book title prompts a ripple of warm laughter from the in the know. Fair enough, he says. I could break his knees. And of course, I guess maybe it's inaccurate to say that the jealousy is still forming, because the jealousy is perfectly pronounced at that point. But it seems to me that forgiveness, that's really the last word of her lecture is, he says, what I wonder would you say to the animals? Forgive us. It strikes me that that's related to a passage that Ivan reads from Dalton's novel right in the moment when he's about to really kind of go over the edge, and right as their marriage is breaking up. And what I'm driving at, or why this occurs to me, is that it strikes me if humans are the measure of all things, and if the proposition of kind of modern civilization is that everything revolves around humanity, that's a profoundly lonely argument. So it's. I'm just going to read this passage. This is from Dalton Field's novel "Forgive Me Not," and this happens right before Prue and Ivan break up. And I'm going to ask you about forgiveness in a love relationship, and also forgiveness in what it means for the animals to forgive. But I want to read this passage first. Essentially, Dalton is writing a passage about lovers, and he's basically saying it's no one's fault that both of them are so lonely. It was possible, now I'm quoting from his novel, it is possible that this loneliness was a condition of the altered love that awaited them later in life. They would feel for each other a new and quiet warmth, she imagined, consisting in their having acknowledged their failure to disclose themselves to one another and forgiving it. So I want to read that again because that seems to me a really emblematic statement, particularly given what Prue and Ivan then later say in the novel when they are essentially realizing that they're going to dissolve their marriage and go their separate ways. Because it seems to me they don't forgive themselves. They would feel for each other a new and quiet warmth, she imagines, consisting in their having acknowledged their failure to disclose themselves to one another and forgiven that failure to disclose themselves. So I guess, what is this novel teaching us about the role of forgiveness? It's in I should say, you're the author of two books. Forgiveness also figures into the 2012 novel that you wrote, Town of Shadows. So,
what you're hearing is not sort of my premeditated ideas that got fleshed out here, but really my thinking with you on this. But I think, there's a book that came out called Love in the Anthropocene a couple years ago by Bonnie Nadzam and the philosopher Dale Jamieson. And in it, they ask what the Anthropocene, the transformation of, the emergence of humans as a geologic force on the planet, but with that, the kind of transformation of the natural world into an artifice will do to our ability to relate to each other and to love. And they invoke an idea from Iris Murdoch about mature love being love that, or really any love, I guess, as honoring the autonomy of the loved object. So they're asking, can one develop a healthy relation to something that is a projection? Probably not. At least that was Murdoch's wager. So, but no, I think that, it's just, I think it's the kind of thing that it's just so staggering when you try to think about, like, if there were an interspecies UN, like how we would fare. And there's this really wonderful thinker, philosopher named Anthony Weston, who has written about the seeming paradox that the safer we get, the more frightened we become. And I think there's a corollary in the forgiveness, guilt, Anthropocene situation of kind of sort of the more we acknowledge the kind of harm we're doing and the wonders that nature holds, and the more that science, this thing that in the West famously kind of disavowed its relationship to nature and declared other beings ghostless machines, is now rediscovering terms like sentience and consciousness in them and publishing them in their scientific papers. Even as we acknowledge that there's this kind of feeling, there's this inner shrinking, I think, from what it would mean to actually think that. Because if we actually thought that and we actually treated other beings as sentient or as persons, as some have argued we should, that would be, I think, devastating for us. Because then our entire history would show up to us in a very different way. It doesn't have to be that dramatic. You can think about the recent ruling in India. A judge declared all non-humans persons, which had implications for humans. Of course, that I think the legal term is in loco parentis.
So I want to return to this question of forgiveness. Forgiveness is on the one hand on the table in the novel. Dalton Field proposes it as the mode of the relation that we should adopt towards the animal kingdom. And it's hard to know whether Prue is joking or not when she says, forgive me. But forgiveness is also on the table in the relationship between Prue and Ivan. that's not just any relationship, that's a relationship that is in some way, I think, allegorical of a college, in that she's from the natural sciences and he's from the Department of Philosophy, and arguably from the humanities. And so what holds for them in their marriage is in some way allegorical of how a college relates to itself. But I want to read this passage again, and then I just want to kind of go to Ivan and Prue at the end of the novel. So Dalton says, in a relationship in which loneliness has been mitigated, there's something like a forgiveness for the failure of each to disclose themselves to another, which is a really interesting way of thinking about love, I think. So that's what Dalton says. They disagree over Dalton at that point. And then at 2:15, later in the novel, Prue and Ivan are talking to each other. And this is right after Ivan's had this whole crisis. He's had a catharsis. He's cried for the first time in a long time. And she has just said, I'm going to take this fellowship, and she's basically leaving, and implicitly leaving him. So they're in the Center for Ornithology, which she helped found. She gazes up into the branches where a pair of finches are pecking at each other. I've been so lonely with you, she says. I take her free hand, stroking the back of it with my thumb, but it stays limp. I've been lonely too, I say. And then they go on to talk about their marriage. Do they forgive each other at the end here, and that's why they go their separate ways, or do they not forgive each other for not disclosing themselves, and that's why they go their separate ways?
I think that part of what they were dealing with, at least my sense, is anger toward themselves at having misunderstood themselves to such an extent that they tethered their lives to a person who was clearly not right for them. And so I think there's forgiveness going on here, but it's also sort of forgiveness of themselves, because it's and that's what enables them to kind of just speak to each other for the first time. There is something that drew them together that they don't understand, but that the dissonance is such that it's just too costly. But so I think, and that's what I think made it especially sad for me to go through it in the writing process, was sort of realizing that they hadn't reached a relation to themselves that they were able to kind of share their lives with another person. Because on the one level, they're not a good match, but that's a little bit of a cop-out answer, because I think both of them really struggle with their relationship to themselves, and that inhibits them from forming a robust kind of mutual understanding with a partner, from forming a partnership in general. So, so in a way, for me, and it's a relationship that I think, ironically, I guess, because Frank's the crazy person, but to me, he has a much more healthy relationship to himself than either one of them do. He's not super egoic concerns about success, professional success, don't really torment him because he's so tormented by other things. But what I think the marriage teaches them, and why it's ultimately, I think, wonderful that they were married, is that they realized this about themselves, that they had kind of been cramped in themselves, and that they're now in a place where they can kind of sally forth in a more authentic mode.
They both say at the end, in various ways, what were we thinking? What was I thinking? For the first time, these two people whose job is to know seem to come into self-knowledge. And it's interesting, then they wouldn't necessarily even know whether they were disclosing or not, because they don't have that self-knowledge.
I think especially because they do have witnesses in the sense of the birds, but there's of course an abyss there that has been there throughout, but now they're literally there in this shrine to the attempt to know another mind, failing to disclose themselves, but still reaching, I think, a more healthy relation to themselves, and therefore, like, to their ability to really moving forward.
Why don't we shift a little bit and talk a little bit more generally about the process of writing and how you imagine the reader. What do you hope that readers take from your book?
I mean, I guess I could only hope that they would feel as I felt finishing it, which was freer to approach old questions in new ways.
I'm sure some viewers watching this are themselves aspiring writers. What advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Well, cultivate rejections. Get enough, as a teacher of mine once said, get enough that you can wallpaper at least a bathroom with them, because if you don't, you're really not doing yourself a service. You do it because you have to. It's a crazy thing to do. It's a form of controlled psychosis. So, but it's also, if you want to do it, you know that it's the most thrilling thing you'll ever experience when you're doing it, and when it's flowing. So I would say, just if you have to do it, then organize your life in such a way that you can do it and that you can cultivate that, as opposed to kind of getting cowed by how difficult it is to be a capital W writer. I think laboratories started as appendages of museums where alchemists would smelt iron. For me, it's always been helpful to think about fiction writing and writing of any kind creatively in that way, as something that sustains you, but that is a little bit off-center, in a way that peripheral vision can be enable you to see more. So I would say be a little suspicious of advice, because it's usually just nostalgia disguised, as someone has said, who I forget. But just do it if you have to.
Well, on that note, I think I want to congratulate you again. Your novel, The Study of Animal Languages, comes out tomorrow on Viking Press, no less. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you today, and I look forward to reading your next one.
It's been a joy. Thank you so much.